studying the movements against racism in the United States that I became familiar with an anti-capitalist politics and was convinced by it. And I think that it was extremely central to the anti-racist struggle, and also these movements were, I think, some of the most significant anti-capitalist movements in the United States. But as I participated in social movements today, and as I saw the kind of political discourse that's prevalent today, that seemed to have been forgotten. And so I wanted to write about how central that was and how closely connected these struggles were historically, and ask why that basic connection has been suppressed. And part of what I think has done that is the way that race has been reframed in terms of identity, which I think is an ineffective way of understanding race and the anti-racist struggle. When I talk about a critique of racial ideology, a large part of what I mean is that racism in the history of the racist discourses from centuries before had the idea that you can explain human variation, human difference, as the expression of different groups, the existence of different groups that are natural and are called races. And the second step of that ideology was to say that these groups are in a hierarchy, and some are superior and others are inferior. Now, most people who are part of polite society don't believe that some racial groups are superior and others are inferior, but they still believe that these groups exist. And I think that we have to go much further and question that very idea. It is false that human variation biologically can be explained by the existence of races. Race in this sense does not exist. Socially, race exists. Socially, as an ideology. An ideology is also a material thing. It's produced by material practices. So this doesn't mean that it's just an illusion. So race is real in the social sense. But in order to understand race without going into racial ideology, without going into the first step of racial ideology, which is the idea that races exist as groups of human beings, we have to have a very different way of understanding the social phenomenon of race. And this means, for me, that we have to be very careful about coming up with general theories of race, as though across millennia and all around the world in every different region, there is something that is the same, common, that is called race, that just exists everywhere. I think, first of all, there are many different kinds of social antagonisms. We may, in many cases, have to explain them in other ways. Religious antagonisms, the idea of civilizational difference. These are not necessarily race. So I think we have to be quite specific. We have to be quite specific about what race is, and we have to distinguish between different instances where it appears. And so in my book, I'm very specific about how race is formed in the United States. I don't think you can just transpose that to another place and say, well, it's the same thing. You have to look at the specificity of that process. And where I differ from the idea of racial capitalism is that I think that we can't make a connection between racism and capitalism, or even race and class, as abstractions. When we talk about racism, when we talk about capitalism, these are abstractions. They are concepts that we're using to understand a social and historical process which is a complex whole. It's not as though we can look at one place over here and say that this is where race is happening, and in the factory over there, that's where class is happening. It doesn't work like that. We can't say that from the 16th century to the 19th century there was race and then now there is class. So we use these concepts to understand aspects of this process, of this whole. And so I think, once again, this idea of specificity, or of what Marx called going from the abstract to the concrete, is what we need to do, rather than taking the whole messy, this messy reality and trying to reduce it down to the most to the most basic concepts, and then explaining their connection as some kind of model. We have to take these ideas that we have in our heads of race and class and capitalism and make them more complex and bring them back down to earth. So first of all, this is a general point about race. I mentioned that I don't think that it's effective to understand race as an identity, because race isn't something that's intrinsic to me. It's not part of who I am. It's the way that I am socially classified by processes that really had nothing to do with me. And you can see that when you look at the formation of race across history, when you understand that it's a social process rather than being something that is a part of what human beings are. And the white race is a very good example, because we know that it has been produced through the extremely different populations of Europe, which within Europe actually were divided into various classificatory systems and existed within hierarchies in which the English were supposed to be superior to the Irish and to the Slavs and so on. How does it happen that when they migrate to the United States, there is a process in which they all become white? Now that's a very clear kind of process that you can see. Of course, in a certain sense it's clear, but in another sense it's very unclear, because now we take it for granted that everybody here is white in the Spanish state. What does it mean to say that? You know, the white race was invented in the United States over a process of centuries, and now we say that someone living in another continent is white. That is racial ideology. And so we have to question that and say, okay, the white race at this fundamental level does not exist, because it is, at least it does not exist as an attribute of people. It exists as a form essentially of social control. And part of this means that the people who are included in the category of whiteness are extended certain privileges, have been extended certain privileges over a period of time in US history. But we should be careful about understanding what those privileges are and what their meaning is, because in a certain way, these privileges, they have obvious advantages, but they also have a great disadvantage, which is that they lead white people to think that they are better, they're already in a better position than the other people who are not members of the white club. And a poor white person who has more in common with a poor black person may think, well, I am best represented by Donald Trump. That is a kind of mentality of white privilege. It's not very good for the poor white opiate addict in rural Virginia, let's say. So this is a problem with the way that white privilege is talked about now. White guilt, white fragility, all this language, it is a solipsism. You know, people think that they're being anti-racist, but they make everything about themselves white people end up making everything about themselves. And they end up reinforcing the idea that there is something natural about being white. And that in a kind of religious sense, they have to they have to atone for their sins. And I don't think that the idea of original sin is a helpful one for politics. There was certainly a labor movement in the United States, and it actually had, it was an important site for the development of the movements against racism, for the development of black movements, because there were attempts to organize black workers who were excluded from the existing unions, and there were attempts to have labor struggles that address the specific issues of black workers that were not going to be realized, or that were not going to be addressed if you just had a general workers' struggle. You had to deal with this special, particular form of oppression experienced by black workers. But the labor movement in the United States was really crushed in a dramatic way that is often, I think, hard for Europeans to understand the level of backwardness we have in the U.S. Around this. And I think it's important to see that the way that a mass movement continued, and it was largely, it can be considered in a significant sense a workers' movement, but I don't want to just reduce it to that. The civil rights movement was the major mass movement of the period from the 50s through the late 60s. And so I think, while in this period you had the various struggles in Europe that were often partly labor struggles and then partly countercultural struggles and so on, but that were really explicitly identified with a kind of anti-capitalist politics. That the civil rights movement isn't often understood that way, but I have argued that it should be, because you can certainly see it in the way that many of the major figures of the movement understood the implications of the struggle they were engaged in. You look at Martin Luther King, who is preoccupied with the question of justice from the beginning of his political career. And many people, I don't know how common this is, how widely known this is in Europe, but often in the US, people on the left will point to the last year of Martin Luther King's life when he made a speech against the war in Vietnam and was participating in what was called the Poor People's Movement. He believed that the civil rights movement at this point had to proceed to a movement against poverty, and the main focus at this point was to organize sanitation workers and to have a sanitation workers strike. But he already, the decade before, right when he was first getting involved in politics, said there's a worldwide movement against imperialism, and everywhere people are rising up against inequality and against domination, and what we are doing here in Montgomery, the Montgomery bus boycott, is part of that. And this was recognized actually around the world at the time. You'll find statements about this, by Mao Zedong. It was not lost on most of the world. And so I think the civil rights movement should be understood in a much more radical way than certainly it was taught to me in school, and the way that it was represented as just kind of a realization of American democracy. But the civil rights movement kind of entered into a crisis because it was operating on the principle of justice as a principle of emancipatory politics, and had a strategy of disobedience, that you have to violate unjust laws. But by 1965, it had led to the introduction of new laws, and that became a kind of turning point where there had to be a decision about where to go next, because they had focused on legal segregation in the South, the segregation by law, and now they had to face the situation that even if you changed the laws, racial domination persisted, and as many of them were pointing out, black people were still poor, and you had to deal with that. And at the same time in the North, not just, but in the North, you had the urban rebellions, the riots that did not fit within the framework of civil rights movement organizing. And so that's a moment where there's a divergence in strategies in the civil rights movement, when Martin Luther King wants to have an acceleration, intensification of civil disobedience against economic inequality, and then others like Bayard Rustin want to have go even further into making policy and changing laws and participating in the electoral system. But it's also at this point that black power becomes a kind of central political perspective, in the sense that it switches from, let's say, the idea of justice as the center of the politics to the idea of political power. So black power meaning black political power. But here too, there is a division, because what is the nature of political power? This really poses the question. Would it be the way that, the person who really popularized the slogan, Kwame Ture, then called Stokely Carmichael, he co-wrote a book with Charles Hamilton called Black Power, in which black political power was really about winning elections in local governments so that black people could follow in the footsteps of Jewish and Italian communities that had managed to build up some kind of political power and a system of a kind of ethnic pluralism. But then you have the example of groups, the most famous being the Black Panthers, who are really posing the possibility of armed insurrection and of the creation of a kind of counterpower through the survival programs and so on. And that is a very important divergence. And ultimately, when ultimately it's the first strategy that wins out. This oppositional politics gets channeled into the state, and there you have another crisis, because now it's the politicians that the mass movements put into power who turn against the mass movements because they are imposing austerity measures. They are trying to demobilize opposition, and that is really a point where it becomes very complicated to figure out how race plays a role in a revolutionary struggle, and I think because of that, difficulty, that's when you start to get the displacement, or what I call the neutralization in the book, of the anti-racist movements by identity. The Black Lives Matter movement is not one unitary thing, and there have been many episodes over the course of several years which have been characterized as Black Lives Matter, and they've happened in different places, and sometimes they've had a spread and resonance across space. Sometimes there's been continuity, but sometimes there has seemed to be a sudden upsurge that it's hard to explain why, because police murders, police racism is there all the time. And why is it that you will have a moment in which one instance becomes the mobilizing force, that one example of something that happens every day suddenly becomes the point where all of the opposition and all of the outrage that people feel and all of their motivation to act becomes concentrated at that point. It's very hard to know when that happens and what are its conditions. It's hard to know what are the conditions that make it so that people will decide that, once again, something that is constantly happening is now motivating me to go out onto the streets every single day for weeks, risk arrest, and spend hours of the day in political meetings. Why does that happen? And you know that's something people talk about in many social movements. I mean, I'm sure you have experienced that here quite recently, and then you had it in the Arab Spring, you had it in Occupy. And one of the dilemmas of that kind of moment is that it's not possible to spend the rest of your life going out every night and fighting the police and then spending the rest of the day in a boring political meeting. You just can't do it. And it's extraordinary that suddenly you become capable of it for a particular period. But unless there is a kind of unless some kind of organizational form is produced that allows this to persist, that allows the politics to persist, even at times when the energy has declined, even at times when the situation is not generating this kind of concentration on a particular, this concentration of a, let's say, of the idea of a universal wrong on one particular incident. At those times, there needs to be a force of organizational continuity, but I would say even more than that, there needs to be a way to maintain the commitment to the kind of emancipatory politics I was talking about before. I think there were 27 million people on the streets in the protests in the United States over the summer, provoked by, this one example of police violence, the murder of George Floyd. But 27 million people, I am quite certain, did not believe in the complete overturning of the capitalist state or of the entire social system. And so you cannot rely on, while on the one hand, we want movements to expand. And my book talks a lot about alliances and coalitions. Some people, especially here, have used the word transversality. I didn't use it, but I guess it's all right. But I think there is another side to it, which is that that can also be a dilution, of a political dilution, and you need to have a kind of contraction. You need to also have the consolidation of those who are committed and steadfast and uncompromising in the commitment to emancipatory politics. Without that, I think a mass movement will not become a revolutionary movement. This contains about 100 different questions, really. So, I mean, there are a number of, let's say, paradoxes of liberalism or of rights, and the one that Marx really emphasized was, early on, was that there is a kind of formal equality that you get through political emancipation. That is when people are said to be equal in rights. But in reality, they are not equal, because even if everyone has the right to property and so on, most people don't actually own it. And so this is a basic kind of contradiction, inconsistency of liberal capitalist societies. But then there's a lot more going on, because you pointed to the idea that there can be individual rights, and then there can be the idea of rights for a particular group. Now, this is a complicated history, because part of the way that emancipation became a general political term, because originally, and we still have this, we have it in English, that emancipation is about the independence of a child from their parents. And that's legally where the term comes from. This is the etymology of the term. How is it that it comes to be used to describe the abolition of slavery, first of all, and then how does it come to be completely generalized in Marx's thinking and the thinking of others to the freedom of everyone? Well, part of it is because different social groups made demands for emancipation: Catholics, Jews, women, and then it was applied to slavery. And Marx, I think, was trying to think of something that went beyond individual freedom, because he said if you continue to call for individual rights, you end up just reproducing the basic category of the market, which is what generates the real inequalities that undermine the formal equality. But it's not clear what the real emancipation is. He sort of suggests in his early writings that it has something to do with overcoming the separation between our own social powers, which are projected onto the state, and our existence socially with each other. So to overcome our atomization and to reabsorb our own powers back into the human community. This is kind of his original conception of real emancipation. I think that the important thing now is to maintain the idea that there is a politics of emancipation of which Marxism was one moment. And for Marxism, universal emancipation would be realized through class struggle. And that was Marx essentially sets out the idea of a real emancipation that goes beyond political emancipation. And it's only after that, very, very soon after that, but after that he identifies the proletariat as the group in society that will achieve this. Why? Because the proletariat has no particular interest of its own. Whereas you could say that there are all these different social groups which we may define in terms of identities, which will say that we have particular interests because of who we are. He says, the proletariat it has no particular interest, so it will be the agent of universal emancipation. Now, is that equation a necessary one? Is it going to be true throughout history? I'm not sure we can maintain these assumptions, but what I think we should maintain is the idea of universal emancipation, and the idea that in order to achieve universal emancipation, we have to proceed not according to the idea of our own interests, either as individuals or as members of a particular group, but by studying a specific situation, a specific political situation, and determining what kind of action is necessary in order to achieve the emancipation of all.